Most people think the stock market is the whole game. It is not. It is a very useful game. It is a respectable game. For a great many people, it is still the safest default game they will ever play. But it is no longer the whole game. That is the sentence I want you to sit with, because it explains why so many intelligent, disciplined people keep doing the right thing and still feel like they are standing outside the real wealth machine with their hands in their pockets. They buy the index, they dollar cost average, they reinvest, they stay patient, and yet a strange suspicion keeps following them around. Why does it still feel like the biggest money got made before I even arrived? The answer is not that the public market is fake. The answer is that the map changed, and most people are still using the old one. I want to begin with a point that will upset some people because it refuses to flatter them. The S&P 500 is still a magnificent default. If you buy a low-cost index fund, keep contributing for decades, avoid panic, and let time do the heavy lifting, you are very likely to do better than a huge number of people who chase excitement and call it sophistication. That part is still true, but a good default is not the same thing as the full opportunity set, and that distinction matters more now than it used to. The first crack in the old story is concentration. People hear 500 companies and imagine broad diversification. What they often own in practice is a much narrower engine dominated by the largest names. S&P Global, S-Own Research has noted that by mid-2025, the 10 largest companies in the S&P 500 represented almost 40% of the index, a level of concentration not seen. Since the mid-1960s, Lazard put the top 10 share at 38.4% in March 2020. That is not fake diversification, but it is far more concentrated than the bedtime story most investors tell themselves. Faysite Fayturn 601673 search 5, Fayturn 601673 search 2 Fay. That means when people say, I am just buying the market. What they may really be saying is, I am making a very large continuing bet that the same cluster of giant companies will keep carrying a growing share of the index, S economics. Maybe that works beautifully, maybe it does not. But it is not the same thing as broad equal opportunity across 500 companies. That is the first thing worth understanding. The second thing is even more important. The public market has fewer doors than it used to, a great deal fewer. Harvard's corporate governance discussion of the long-running listing decline points back to earlier research, showing the number of publicly listed U.S. firms peaked in 1996 at more than 8,000. Other research summaries put the count below 4,000 by 2020, with the 2012 trough around 3,800. However you slice it, the pond is much smaller than it once was. Faysite Fayturn 603561 search 1, Fayturn 603561 search 5, Fayturn 603561 search 13 Fay. This is one of the most important structural changes in American capitalism, and ordinary investors barely talk about it. When the number of public companies shrinks, the public market becomes less of a wide frontier and more of a curated showroom. It still matters. It still contains great businesses, but there are fewer of them, and the ones that arrive often arrive later in their life cycle. That later is where the pain lives. A generation ago, a greater share of a company's explosive growth often happened after it became public. Ordinary investors could participate earlier in the curve today. Much of that early velocity often occurs while the company is still private. Venture capital, growth equity, sovereign wealth, family offices, and private funds finance the awkward, explosive, dangerous middle. By the time the business reaches the public market, a large portion of the romantic upside has already been absorbed elsewhere. That is why so many ordinary investors feel like they are buying quality and missing velocity, because increasingly that is exactly what is happening. Now, I want to be honest with you. There are reasons for this that are not evil. Going public is expensive. Being public is expensive. Living under the permanent theater of quarterly judgment is expensive. The SEC's own consideration of possible changes to the reporting cadence in 2026 makes clear that smaller and medium-sized firms do feel real cost and compliance pressure from public company life, even though the broader market still appears attached to quarterly communication. That pressure is not imaginary. Faysite Fayturn 603561 News 42 Fay. If I were a founder building a good business and private capital were lining up to fund me, why would I race toward the public market just to be shouted at every 3 months by people who confuse short-term noise with long-term strategy? That is not a foolish question. It is a rational one. So the private world got deeper and the public world got later. That is the structural shift. The richest people in the room understand this instinctively. They do not think of public markets as the place where all money is made. They think of them as one layer, a good layer, a liquid layer, a respectable long-term compounding layer. But still only one layer. The more aggressive wealth creation often happens before the ticker exists or outside the ticker entirely. This is the point where many people become either too cynical or too dreamy. The cynic says the stock market is a scam, that is childish. The dreamer says private markets are where all wealth comes from, and therefore he should abandon public investing and chase every private opportunity he can sniff. That is equally childish. I do not want either instinct. I want structure. Here is the structure. Public markets are excellent for preserving discipline, compounding liquidity, and owning great businesses at scale. Private markets are where a greater share of the early, ugly, mispriced relationship driven upside now lives. That means the right question is not which world is real. The right question is what role should each world play in my life? To answer that, you need to understand another uncomfortable truth. The private world is not just unicorns and sexy startups. Most of it is boring. Blessedly boring. Local services, industrial suppliers, maintenance businesses, HVAC plumbing, distribution, niche manufacturing, software workflows that nobody brags about at dinner. Boring is important because boring cash flows often make millionaires more reliably than glamorous stories do. The average person still imagines wealth as a breakthrough event, a hot stock, a startup hit, a crypto miracle. In reality, an enormous amount of wealth is created by owning something dull, necessary, and cash generative for a very long time. This is where the source material you gave me is strongest. It is not really arguing that everyone should stop buying index funds. It is arguing that the private ownership layer of the economy still contains a kind of opportunity ordinary people are trained not even to see. That is true, and 2026 does make that conversation more interesting because private equity has a real inventory problem. McKinsey estimated in its 2026 report that more than 16,000 PE-owned companies globally had been held for more than 4 years, equivalent to 52% of total buyout-backed inventory, with the typical company now held for more than 6.5 years. Bain's 2026 report likewise described the stock of unrealized assets as roughly 32,000 companies and noted average holding periods near 7 years. In plain English, a lot of owners want exits, and many assets have been sitting longer than the old script expected. Faysite Faturn 603561 search 6 Faturn 603561 search 2 Fay. When motivated sellers meet informed buyers, strange things happen. Not magic, not guaranteed steals, but windows open. That does not mean you sitting at your laptop tonight should suddenly imagine yourself buying SpaceX next week or taking over a private equity portfolio because a YouTube thumbnail made it look easy. That would be idiotic. What it does mean is that the field of boring business ownership is wider, more fragmented, and more negotiable than the average index fund-only investor has been taught to believe. This is where wealth gets very practical. If you want $200,000 a year from a public portfolio using a conservative withdrawal frame, you need a very large pile of capital. If you want $200,000 a year from ownership of cash flowing private businesses, the path can look very different. It may require operator skill, patience, relationships, nerves, and tolerance for mess. But it can also require less starting net worth than the public market version because you are buying control and cash flow, not just renting exposure to returns. That is why business ownership changes lives, not because it is easy, because it changes the arithmetic. Now, I want to be very clear about something. Private ownership is not passive. This is where fools get hurt. People here buy a business and imagine a monthly cash machine quietly raining checks into their account while they sip coffee and talk about freedom. That fantasy has destroyed many amateurs. A business is not an ETF with a logo. It is a machine with people, systems, customers, maintenance, legal issues, financing structure, operational fragility, and all the ugliness that comes with real life. You do not outperform the index here by being excited. You outperform by being competent. That is why the intelligent comparison is not public bad, private good. The intelligent comparison is public markets reward patience, private markets reward competence. And the most dangerous person in either domain is the one who confuses enthusiasm with skill. So where does that leave the ordinary investor in 2026? It leaves him with a decision. He can keep pretending the public index is the whole economy and accept the increasingly late-stage nature of what he is buying. or he can keep the public index as a core compounding engine while beginning to educate himself on private ownership opportunities that are ugly, local, boring, and potentially transformative. I know what I would do. I would not abandon the index. I would stop worshiping it. I would still use low-cost public equities as a foundational asset. They are too useful. Too liquid, too time-tested to dismiss lightly. They belong in the toolkit. But I would stop telling myself that buying the SP 500 means I have captured the full richness of American enterprise. I have not. I have captured the listed slice, a valuable slice, not the whole pie, and once you see that clearly, your behavior changes. You become more curious about local businesses. You start understanding seller financing structures. You begin to notice that not every great opportunity arrives with a ticker symbol. You understand why some rich families obsess less over what stock should I buy, and more over what asset or business can I control, improve, and hold. You stop asking only how to participate in the market. You begin asking how ownership itself works. That question is the door. Now, because this is Buffett Voice, I will tell you exactly where many people go wrong once that door opens. They become intoxicated by private market romance. They imagine every local business is a hidden gold mine. It is not. Some are terrible, some are traps, some are managed disasters with accounting that should require prayer before reading. Some are fine businesses at stupid prices. Some are being sold because the future is worse than the trailing 12 months suggest. This is why private investing cannot be learned from slogans. It must be learned from numbers, operators, contracts, incentives, and patience. That is harder. It is also why the opportunity exists at all. The average person is not excluded only because of money. He is excluded because this world requires attention most people never trained. That is fixable. And that is what makes 2026 interesting. The public market has become narrower and more top-heavy. A large share of high-growth private upside occurs before public investors are invited in. Private equity has inventory that needs exits. Public company life remains expensive and unpleasant enough that many companies still delay or avoid the listing path, and thousands upon thousands of ordinary, boring, cash-flowing businesses continue to exist beneath the notice of the average investor who only knows how to press buy on an index fund app. That is the real situation. Not apocalypse, not scam, a map change, and once the map changes, the investor has to change too. I would do three things. First, I would keep buying the broad public market if that is my long-term core, because discipline still matters and liquidity still matters. Second, I would become intellectually honest about concentration and about how late in the growth curve many public listings now arrive. Third, I would start learning the language of business acquisition, local private markets, cash flow analysis, seller financing, and transition ownership. Not because every person should buy a company tomorrow, but because an investor who does not understand the private layer is walking through modern capitalism with one eye closed. That is not how I like to walk through the world. The stock market is not dead. Dollar cost averaging is not dead. What is dead is the childish belief that buying the public index means you have captured the whole wealth game. You have not. You have captured the civilized, accessible, liquid, respectable half of it. For many people, that will still be enough. But if you want to understand how the quietly rich often got there, you have to look earlier, uglier, and closer to the ground. That is where the businesses are. That is where the transfers happen. And that is where ownership starts feeling less like a ticker and more like a life strategy.